Well, just, I just wanted to say I was just honored and invited Master Gardeners here tonight to present to you. You're such an awesome group, and I'm excited to talk to you. I hope that my talk will be informative, because it also sounds as if, in addition to being very committed to the environment, that you're also very knowledgeable about our environment. So, I also work with the bird-friendly habitat of Audubon. I know Nikki mentioned that you had an Audubon speaker at some point, and am what's called a journeyman beekeeper with Orange County, and I am just completing my final project for my certification in native plants from the North Carolina Botanical Gardens. So that just, I think that covers sort of what my background is in terms of presenting tonight. So I will go ahead, and I know Nikki wants time for questions if you have any at the end. I guess people are going to put questions in the chat box, Nikki, is that right? Okay.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
Started. So pollinators in the Piedmont, these are probably pollinators that are actually native to North Carolina, but you know, that's your title. So just quickly to overview, it's what is pollination, what makes a good pollinator, and who are our Piedmonts in the Piedmont. So a simple definition of pollination is that pollination occurs when the pollen is moved from the anther, which is the male part of the flower, to the stigma, which is the female part of the flower. And this is just a drawing representing a flower. Collectively, the female parts of the flower are called the pistil, and that includes the stigma, the style, the ovary, and then inside the ovary are the ovules, or the eggs. And the male part of the pollen is collectively called the stamen. The anther is where the pollen is held and produced, and the filament's only job is to hold that anther up so that as pollinators move across the anthers, that they have easy access to pick up pollen. Most pollinators are just, well, they're all incidentally pollinating the plant. They're not here purposely pollinating. They're really after the nectar, which is usually right down here at the base of the filaments. So if you think about the pollinator coming across, brushing across the anthers, perhaps picking up some of those pollen grains, and it flies over the stigma, some of those pollen grains will fall off. The stigma is a little bit sticky, so it will hold on to the pollen, and then the pollinator will go down here to seek out nectar. Once a pollen grain falls on the stigma, it will grow a little pollen tube, and that pollen tube will extend all the way down to the ovaries. Once that pollen tube has developed, it will then, the little sperm then will slide down there, and it will fertilize one of those eggs. I'm sorry, my husband had something going on in the kitchen and it distracted me. I apologize. Once, it takes about 9 visits from a pollen to fully pollinate a flower, but once this flower is fully pollinated, it will stop producing nectar, because its only purpose in producing nectar is to attract a pollinator. So it stops producing nectar, and actually the whole flower just dies back, and all the energy of the plant is going into reproducing this seed now. And you know, we know for agricultural plants that is going to occur when we're going to then get fruits or vegetables because of all of that pollination. There are other ways of pollination. Very light, airy pollen can get blown by the wind. Water plants can get pollinated through the water. but the vast majority, about 80% of population, occurs through animals. And for most animals, it is, most of those, great majority of those animals are insects. So what makes an effective pollinator? Well, mobility is really important. We want, because an animal that can move from flower to flower is going to be much more effective than an animal that isn't as mobile. And I'll start using the word insect, but insects that have stiff bristles of hair, they're called scopa on the body of the insect, and those scopa will catch pollen as the insect moves over the anthers from plant, and it moves from plant to plant. Pollinators who eat only nectar and pollen throughout their lives are going to be more effective pollinators, because that means they're going to be on the plants more often than pollinators who rely on other sources of nutrition. Pollinators that practice flower fidelity, horticulturalists will also use the term flower constancy, where the pollinator is visiting the same species of flower on each foraging, during each foraging trip. So the pollinator is going to move from aster to aster to aster versus going from aster, say, to a goldenrod and then on to a blue mist flower. So we really want that pollen going to a flowering species. So we're going to look at some pollinators now and think about which are effective pollinators in our environment. This is the goldenrod soldier beetle. I see this beetle a lot on my flowers in the late summer, not just on goldenrod, but on other flowers that are blooming at the same time. It has wings, so that's good. It's very mobile and moving from plant to plant. But its body is hairless, and it has many food sources besides nectar. In fact, this beetle got its name as a soldier beetle, several or many species of soldier beetles, because as it's seeking nectar, it's also patrolling the plant and eating other insects on the plant. It does not eat the leaves or harm the plant in any way, but it may be eating other insects that are such as aphids that are harmful to the plant. And so it's not a great pollinator, does do some pollination, but its real ecological value is as an insect predator. And then ants. Ants are always in the list of the animals. So ants, though, have limited mobility, and you can see they have a hairless body. The plants that they do pollinate tend to be plants that are very low to the ground, like the violets and the clovers that are in our grass. And they have many food sources besides nectar. We've all seen a little ant drag an insect twice its size across our driveways. So ants are providing some pollination. They're not great at it, but they're real ecological value as is decomposers in our environment. They eat other bugs, organic material. While they're doing all this, they're aerating the soil, and they even will eat mammals, dead mammals that may be present in the environment. So wasps, are they good pollinators? Well, these are two wasps that I see frequently in my gardens in the summer, about midsummer, the scoliid wasp and the great black digger wasp. They are mobile, and as adult wasps, they're relying largely on nectar for their nutrition and their energy. So they're all over flowers in the summertime. But again, wings, so they're very mobile, but they have hairless bodies and they have these long legs. So you can see with this wasp, it's not even coming in contact with the anthers of the flower. So wasps do some pollination, but again, they're not great at it. And they're not relying upon pollen and nectar for their whole lifestyle. When they're larvae, they are fed paralyzed insects by their mothers. And so the female wasp will capture it, sting it to subdue it, and then bring it back to the nest and feed it to its larvae. So the larvae is not eating dead insects. It has a nice, live, juicy insect to nourish it. So wasps' real ecological value is as predators of other insects. And this is a photo of a cicada killer wasp, the cicada prey. One interesting fact about wasps is that the government of Germany has passed a law making it a crime to destroy a wasp nest. So what's really cool, I don't know if they've ever really prosecuted anybody, but what's really cool about it is that the government of Germany recognizes the value of wasps in their environment. Because not many people appreciate wasps. Are birds good pollinators? We only have one bird pollinator in the Piedmont, and that is the ruby-throated hummingbird. Its long beak does incidentally collect pollen as it's going from flower to flower. And it's, as you know, it's highly dependent on nectar, nutrition as an adult. It does feed its nestlings a combination of regurgitated insects with a little bit of nectar mixed in with that. And this is a picture of a female ruby-throated hummingbird as she's seeking nectar from a long tubular flower. Most of our other pollinators do not have, with their insects, their proboscis or their tongue is not long enough to access the nectar down here, so they're not visiting these long tubular flowers. It's really, so it's really important. So the hummingbirds are important in pollinating these really long tubular flowers. The hummingbird's primary ecological value, though, is as prey and predator. So we know they prey on insects to feed their nestlings, but they're also prey for other animals. So hawks like to catch hummingbirds. If a mammal can get a hold of a hummingbird, they will eat up the hummingbird. And this is even a picture of a crane that was obviously hanging around a hummingbird feeder just to try to catch a hummingbird to take back to its nest. So are moths and butterflies good pollinators? We certainly think of them as good pollinators. This is a picture of a swallowtail butterfly on a Turk's cap lily. And you can see it's because of the unique morphology of this flower that its body is coming in contact with the nectar. And when it goes to another Turk's cap lily, there's certainly going to be pollination and cross-fertilization occurring. I do want to mention, I did get permission from Jeff Pippin to use this photo. He's got a wonderful website if any of you are interested in really cool photos of not just insects, but other animals too. But on most plants, most flowers, the butterflies do not have hairy bodies, and like the wasp, they have long legs. They're doing some pollination as they flip from flower to flower, but they're not great at it. And then this is a moth. Moths are slightly better than butterflies because they do have some hairs on their abdomen. And moths are out seeking nectar from flowers at night. Many moths, though, do not, their whole purpose when they come out of the chrysalis as adults is to lay eggs on plants, on flowers, and lay their larvae. And after they're done laying, they die. They don't have mouth parts even to get nectar from the plant. So many of our moths are not doing any kind of pollination. And their real ecological values, they're extremely important as nutrition for baby birds. And I think you all know this, but this is, of course, the monarch and the milkweed. The monarch caterpillar can only eat the leaves of the milkweed. And all butterflies and moths have these unique evolutionary relationships with very specific plant species. So they have developed, over time, the metabolism to detoxify the toxins in the leaves that they're eating, because all toxins to protect themselves. But these caterpillars with their host plants are able to detoxify the toxins and get nourished by the leaves. Unfortunately, for the caterpillars at least, and part of the food web, it's important, but unfortunately for these little caterpillars, they're probably never going to reach the chrysalis stage, because about 95% of these, I've even heard as high as 98%, but at least 95% of these caterpillars are being eaten by birds. They're the critical source of nutrition for baby birds. Baby birds cannot eat seeds. They really need these soft, nutritious caterpillars to survive. Doug Tallamy, many of you may have heard about him. He's a well-known entomologist from the University of Delaware. He did studies that demonstrate that it takes anywhere from 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, I think depending on how many baby birds are in the nest, but 6,009 caterpillars to raise one clutch of chickadees, which are fairly small birds, to nestling status. And once they're nestlings, they still need to rely for most of their nutrition on caterpillars, or once they're fledglings, I'm sorry, they still need to rely on caterpillars for nutrition. Today, we have 2.9 billion fewer birds in North America than we had in 1970. So in 50 years, we lost 290 billion. So that's quite a lot, which is why native plants are so critically important. So we talked a lot about different pollinators. They all have critically important roles in our ecosystem, but they're not real great at pollination. They do pollinate, but they're not great at it. Bees are the real superheroes of pollination. This is a little honeybee, and this is a robust native bumblebee. This honeybee, it's not obvious from the picture. She also has little hair all over her body, including on her eyes. So bees have those scopes that are so important. They're the only insects that deliberately collect pollen because their larvae are reliant upon the amino acids and other nutrients in the pollen. Bees feed only on nectar and pollen throughout their life cycle. They are not carnivorous like some of the other insects that we've talked about. And again, as I mentioned, they have these hair on their bodies. They have that scope on their bodies that will easily and incidentally pick up the pollen as they fly over the anther. And they demonstrate that flower fidelity about earlier. So I'm going to talk about just different categories of bees. Talking about species of bees would get pretty complicated. We're going to highlight a few, but just categories. So I'm going to first talk about differences between our male and our female bees. At the end of the foraging season, and for different species, it's different. For some species, the end of their foraging season may be late spring, others it may be midsummer, others it may be at the end of the summer. But whatever their foraging season is, at the end of that foraging season, the adult bees will die off, and only the reproductive males will overwinter in their nest. And they're almost always overwintering as pupa in a cocoon, but some are pre-pupa, a few are adults. So the next spring, the males and females will emerge. It may be, for some species, it may be more towards summer, but they'll emerge, they'll mate, the males will die shortly thereafter, and the females will begin building nests for the next generation. There are a few species that emerge as adult bees. and M is the bumblebee, that they will then emerge in the spring as adult bees. They will mate at that point, and then the males will die off. So the males are overwintering with the females, and I'm sorry, they're not overwintering with the females. They're emerging from the nest late in the summer at the same time as the females, and they are overwintering. So with the bumblebee, everybody in that whole bumblebee colony dies off, including the queen bee, and it's only these reproductive males and females that will emerge to mate. And then male bees do ringers. You all probably know that bees are very unlikely to sting you anyway, unless you're disrupting their colony. So that's why honeybee keepers wear their suits. But people think they're stung by bees, and it's almost always they're getting stung by yellow jackets, which are very aggressive wasps. So I want to talk a little bit about solitary versus social bees. Bumblebees are the only native social bee in North America. Of course, we have our honeybees, but honeybees are not native to this country. They were brought to America with the European immigrants in the 1600s. So we're not going to talk about honeybees today. We're just going to talk about native bees. And so the bumblebee, as a social bee, has a division of labor in its nest. Initially, that female bee that is mated, has overwintered, she comes out, she has to initially take on all the jobs of finding a nest and provisioning the nest. But once those female worker bees emerge, they begin taking on all the work activities of the nest, and the queen bee, that reproductive female, becomes the queen bee, and all she has to do is lay eggs. The drones, their only job is to mate with the reproductive females. Ideally, and most of the time, they're mating with females from other nests, not their own. So those female workers are feeding and caring for eggs and larvae until they pupate. The solitary bees, that's not happening. The solitary bee is provisioning a pollen, laying that egg, closing the cell, and there's no care of the bee at all. With social colonies, there will be several generations present in the nest at the same time. Solitary, it's only one at a time. And unlike the solitary bees, bumblebees will sting to defend their colony. Solitary bees don't have a colony to protect. We have over 265 bumblebee species native to the U.S. 22 of those species are native to North Carolina. And that's in comparison, we have about 100 species of native bees in North Carolina overall. And it seems kind of counterintuitive because we see so many bumblebees in our environment versus other species. Part of the reason for that is that they are social bees. So their colonies peak at about 400 bees. And a solitary bee is at most going to have 10 to 15 offspring per year. And oftentimes it is much less than that, or oftentimes it's like 5 or 6. Bumblebees will forage about a mile from their nest. Our solitary bees are probably a few hundred feet. And because of their robust size, bumblebees can practice buzz pollination, or some people refer to it as sonic pollination, to extract difficult to access pollen. And what they do is they start vibrating their thoracic muscles to shake that pollen loose. So that's a very valuable ability to have in pollination. So bumblebees nest underground. They like to use old rodent holes, partially because those rodent holes have hair in them for insulation. They don't, though, use the rodent's access. They use this, this tiny, they'll make their own little tunnel down in there, probably to prevent predation. If you were to dig this up, this is what the bumblebee nest would look like. First, you get stung a lot. because they'd be defending their nest. But other than that, you're going to see closed brood where the bees are pupating, some open cells, closed cells where the brood, they're pupating, some open cells where there's eggs and larvae so they can get nutrition from the worker bees who are feeding them pollen or a little bit of nectar. And then you're going to have what they call the honey pots, which are just the cells where they are storing the nectar that then becomes honey. So we know the bumblebee is an in-ground nester, an underground nester, and about 70% of our native bees are going to nest underground. Most of them dig their own tunnels for their laying chambers. The bumblebee we know usually finds other places to nest. On rare occasions, the bumblebee will above ground cavity and build its nest in that, but for the most part, that's pretty rare. For the most part, they're underground. Above ground nesting bees do not dig their own nest or make their own nest. They use nests already in the environment. They're going to be nesting in flower stems, in old beetle tunnels and logs, or in man-made tubular objects. So, for example, bee hotels. And of course, all of these above ground nesting bees are solitary. One exception to this, I'm really not going to talk about this bee, but we all know about carpenter bees, and they do dig tunnels into wood. This is an example of an underground nest. So it's, you can see at the top, there are all these little mounds here, each representing a separate nest. And this is it's called aggregate nesting. This is most commonly how we see bees nesting. They're nesting close together, but there's no cooperation. There's no social behavior. It's kind of like an apartment building where they each have their own little entrance, and then they have to lay their eggs in their own little channels within the tunnel. These occur usually so that it's not raining directly into the tunnel, in a sunny spot, and preferably where they're really not going to be disturbed, because these little bees are living in these nests for 10 to 11 months a year. And so you really do not want these nests disturbed, or you're going to disturb all the bees that are pupating in there. So a very common name for underground nesting bees are miner bees, and that's a common name used for more than 400 species of underground bees. Also often called digger bees too. They, one exception to this is the chimney bee, because they use mud to make these entrances to their tunnels, which look like chimneys. So this particular bee does have particular species does have a separate common name from the other miner bees. And then here's an example of an above ground bee nest. This is the bees that is emerging from its nest in a stem in the spring. The males emerge, and when the females, and they acclimate, they get nutrition, the females emerge, and they haven't eaten for 10 months. They're still weak, they're acclimating to the difference in temperature, and the males will mate with them, and then the males will die. And the little female then will acclimate, get pollen herself, or get nectar herself, get nutrition, and then, I'm sorry, I'm running past. And then she will then begin building her own nest. It takes multiple trips with pollen to get a pollen ball. She will lay in the pollen ball, and then she will close that cell off and then proceed to get more pollen for another pollen ball. You notice the difference in the pollen, the amount of the pollen. That's because she's laying her male eggs at the end, because as soon as the larvae finishes its pollen ball, it's going to pupate. And by not giving the males as much nutrition, she guarantees they're going to pupate first and they're going to emerge first from the nest. And they don't really need as much nutrition. They have short lives. So it's really the females that need all of that nutrition to propagate the species. This is my favorite above ground nesting bee. It's called a leafcutter bee. It is able to cut a little semicircle out of a leaf, carry it back to the tubular object that it's chosen as its nest, roll the leaf up, put it in the tubular object, and then build it, begin gathering pollen and laying eggs in that. So if you see this leaves like this at your house, you can, when you see these little semi-smooth edges of leaves, that means you have a leafcutter bee in your yard. Now, you'll see other little holes in the middle of leaves, and that means there's insect activity. And on native plants, that's usually a good sign that insects are benefiting from the native plants. But this is what you have when you know for sure you have a leafcutter bee. Generalist versus specialist bees. 75% of our bees are generalist bees. That means they'll forage on many different plant species, even non-native plants. They're the nectar, and that's what they'll go. So they're not fussy about where it comes from. And they do collect pollen too, obviously. But the specialist bees, just like our moths and butterflies with their host plants, the specialist bees have evolved a specific relationship with a few or even just one plant species. And that relationship is primarily related to the pollen. Nectar is a pretty simple substance. It's primarily just sugar, whereas pollen is a much more complex substance. It can have a variety of up to 18 different acids, many other nutrients, and the native bees have adapted so that their larvae can only eat pollen from these specialist plants. We have about 125 specialist bee species in North Carolina, and their populations are at greater risk than the generalist bees because they are reliant upon these specialist plants that they absolutely need to survive. The specialist bees will emerge from their nest when their specific forage plants begin to flower. So, for example, the Southeastern bumblebee bee will emerge when the blueberry plants start to flower. And blueberry pollen is heavy, it's sticky, it's tucked away inside those long tubular flowers. Like the bumblebees, I think this may be the only other bee that's able to practice buzz pollination, but like the bumblebee, the blueberry bees can attach themselves to the flowers, vibrate, they say their flight muscles, their thoracic muscles to shake that pollen loose. And they usually have nests in the ground, nests, and they're active for about 5 weeks a year, about the time that the blueberry plants are blooming. When the blueberry plants start blooming, that's the end of their foraging season. Generalist bees possess much more sophisticated metabolic and detoxification systems than specialists. They're able to manipulate flowers of many plant genera, which have many different floral morphologies. And because they're not relying upon one or two species of plants, they have a much longer active specialist bee. And they may have several broods during that season because they're not dependent upon those special plants. Surprisingly, to me at least, is that one of our most valuable generalist pollinators is the sweat bee. They're so tiny, but they do have hair all over their body. It's not very obvious, but they do have little hairs. And according to the USDA, these sweat bees pollinate 80% of the canopies and forests, and they are very important pollinators for wildflowers and crops. They have very complex digestive systems that allow them to pollinate over 20 families of plants. So those 20 families in North Carolina, that includes like 1,000 species. So they're quite important and available to pollinate many different plants in our environment. We often think of them as just the pesky little insects that get on our arms. They're not stinging us. What they're doing is licking our perspiration off, the moisture. And unlike the other native bees we talked about, they may raise 9 to 12 broods per season, which is a lot. You know, at the most, the other native bees some of them may produce 3 broods a season. So maybe one of the reasons they are so effective as pollinators is that they just have larger numbers. So I sent the handouts to Nikki that I think she's going to share with you. I know she's going to share with you about some more information about wild pollinator population timing and how you can do your yard as an ecological habitat. I think Nikki was telling me about some of the wonderful work that y'all are doing in the community. I think you probably are all doing much of this stuff. And I'm speaking to, very environmentally committed and active people here. And again, I appreciate you inviting me to talk tonight. And I want to say I was at a Master Gardener meeting today, and I told him I was going to speak to you all. They were all very impressed. So we appreciate the invitation. So I'm ready to take questions if y'all have any questions.
Yes, and there.
Sorry, go ahead, Nikki.
No, so yeah, before we get into the questions, I just wanted to respond really quickly to what you just said, Jeanne. We thank you for coming and sharing all of this information. And you will see it if you scroll the chat too. A lot of us were learning a lot of information today. Never even thought about sweat bees more than them being an annoyance as I'm outside doing all the things, didn't know how important they were to our environment. So thank you for your time and coming and sharing your information, your expertise with us today. We really do appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm just glad that y'all didn't know all this. I was hoping there was some new information in here.
Yeah, even from the basic biology of plants, like it's been a while since I've looked at that. So I really appreciated that information too.
Oh, good. Yeah, when I heard Beth was the pollinator expert, it's like I got a little nervous there, but I hope I did okay.
Do not get nervous. An expert by no means. I can learn all the time. That's my passion.
Yeah.
I happen to love pollinators, and that's just been something instilled in me from grandparents, my mom to me. We've always been avid gardeners and farmers and just enjoy making sure we plant, as my grandma would say, plant and harvest enough for the bees and for yourself. So.
Oh, isn't that wonderful? She must have been a wonderful grandmother, right?
Was. All right, I want to get to some of these questions. Christina asked, where can we get milkweed to grow to attract and feed these swallowtail caterpillars?
So milkweed is a native plant, so it well in our environment, with our clay soil, our hot, humid summers. So if you plant it, it should grow. It's just once it has very long taproot. Once you plant it, you can't really say transplant it anywhere, but you can either plant it by seed, and usually people that have milkweed are more than happy. They've got more seeds and they know what to do with when those plants go to seed. So you can plant it by seed. Just read the directions. It's such tiny little seed. You don't want to cover it with dirt. You just want to kind of press it into the soil. And the thing to remember is that it may not bloom the first year. It may, but oftentimes perennials take time. The phrase is, first year they sleep, second year they creep, third year they leap. So eventually you'll get a nice, healthy looking plant. Does that kind of answer the question about where? Because the butterflies are going to find it. If you plant it, they're going to find it.
Right. I was going to chime in. Yeah, I was going to chime in and say that's really good. And also local nurseries here in the area. Keep Durham Beautiful also does milkweed giveaways from time to time. We've done some plant giveaways, and what normally ends up happening around May, June is people are willing to get rid of some of that milkweed. But just like she said,
Facebook groups.
Yeah, lots of Facebook groups. Yes, thanks, Nadi, about milkweed here locally in the Triangle and giveaways. And once you plant it, though, it spreads by rhizome underneath the soil. So you cannot decide, I want to get rid of it. If you would like to plant it in a planter of some sort, and the butterflies will definitely come get it. Purple coneflower is another one that's really great and attracts butterflies, and native black-eyed Susans as well. So you can plant those if you don't want to go the milkweed route, but they will also attract your butterflies and bring in some caterpillars. And with North Carolina Wildlife Federation, we actually have a seed pack that you could purchase if you wanted to. I'm dropping the link in the chat, but that also contains more seeds than you can think about, and it's seeds of nothing but pollinators, and you can just scatter it across your yard. And I just scattered some in some planters last year, and stuff grew, took off, and then things are coming back this spring. So that's a really good question. Hopefully that answered everything for you. I'm gonna go down again in questions. Nikki, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was about to put in a quick plug for the Butterfly Highway. So if you've been on today, you got this great information, like, I want to be a resource in terms of having some areas for butterflies to have a pit stop, definitely feel free to join the Butterfly Highway. And you can do that online. I don't have the link handy, but I'll drop that in the chat for folks.
Same link.
Oh, same link. There we go. So definitely feel free to join. And I would love to know if new folks end up joining. So feel free to reach out to Bull City Trailblazers and let us know, because I'm always interested in that type of information. So I'll put our email address in the chat as well.
Thanks. The next question I see is from Linda. It says, if 70% of native bees nest underground and prefer loamy soil, where can they find a suitable underground nesting site in our heavy clay soil? Great question.
That is a great question. I think that is, I didn't mention loamy soil. I probably should have taken that out, but they do sometimes. It's easier for them in looser soil. They're digging these tunnels. There is a bee, the mason bee actually prefers clay. They're actually above ground nesters. So they use clay to make their above ground nest and prefer clay. But it's looser soil is better soil. But I think that's a really good point, is that with our clay soil, the bees are harder to dig their tunnels, but they definitely will do that. So you just don't want it real compacted soil.
Great. Our next
But that was
question,
a really good pickup.
It was. And Jennifer pointed out, thank you, Jennifer, that if you do plant milkweed by seed, you need to do it in the fall, because it does need a cold snap to trigger the spring germination. Very true. Mm-hmm. So if you plant it right now, make sure you have a slip or something that's already bloomed. Or I say blossomed, I should say, germinated. There we go. That's the word. Gregory wrote another question. He said, I've heard that the pollen of Carolina jessamine is toxic to bees. I have a large G. sempervirens blooming right now. Should I cut it down and maybe plant coral honeysuckle?
Coral honeysuckle is a great plant. I have yellow jessamine, and I have just 2 honeybee hives, but honeybees will generally, and I think this is probably true for most bees, because it is a toxic pollen, they will avoid, there's just nothing else in the environment for them to find. And usually around the time that the jessamine, the yellow jessamine is blooming now, but we also have all these wonderful redbud trees blooming all over the place, which are a very good source of nectar and pollen. So they will usually avoid those. I haven't heard of anybody having that problem with their bees, but there are people also that cut theirs down because they don't want to risk it. But you don't have, definitely plant other things that are, especially that are blooming at the same time as the jasmine. So they do have other sources of nectar and pollen.
Thank you. And I see DL Roy says you can mix your household compost with your clay soil to make it a little bit looser and loam type of soil. And Jennifer added, interesting about Carolina jessamine, the carpenter bees seem to like it.
And so it may not be toxic. I know it's toxic to honeybees. It may not be toxic to carpenter, that they're able to metabolize it.
Are there any other questions that you all would like to post or pose at this time?
I think there was one.
Where do sweat bees live? I'm sorry, that's a question that just came up.
Sweat bees are primarily ground nesting bees. And sweat bees there's such a diverse genera that some of them actually have social colonies. They're primarily solitary bees. Some of them have social, and then sometimes the same bees will vacillate between being social or solitary depending upon the environment that they're in. But they are primarily ground nesting bees.
Thank you. And Natalie writes, I have a couple of butterfly bushes that pollinators seem to love, but I don't think those bushes are native. Are they still helpful?
Audubon, which is very focused on native plants, Audubon will say get rid of your butterfly bushes because they're actually becoming invasive. And if you look at the North Carolina invasive plant list, they will be the butterfly, the Bedelia genus is documented as being invasive in North Carolina. But they do produce nectar. So we're going to see our bees and butterflies on our butterfly bushes. But if you have a choice to buy, I wouldn't buy a butterfly bush. If you've got one and you want to keep it, I wouldn't tell anybody to cut it down. But on bird-friendly habitat visits, so I accompany the plant experts and I'm the recorder, they will recommend that people remove their butterfly bushes because they are invasive and plant a native shrub instead.
Thank you. I open it up.
All really great questions.
Yeah, I open it up if there are any other questions at this time. I think I've gotten them all out the chat.
Can I just say my mind is still blown about the sweat bees, though? That's going to take a while to settle in and process because I never knew.
It's like they're aptly named, but you don't know why. I definitely
exactly.
You're like, oh.
So should I just sign off then, Nikki, or?
Yeah, if we don't have any other questions, absolute last call, any questions. I will say after this, thank you, Jeanne, for putting up this resource slide. So if you do have questions after you leave here, definitely feel free to either reach out to us, Full CD Trailblazers. You have our email address that's been dropped in the chat, or Jeanne has been so kind to include her email address on here as well. And I'll go ahead and put this out here and I'll follow up with you via email, but I would love to have the slide deck that you shared tonight so we can share that out with the recording and then the handouts as well, and make sure folks can have all of that in one go. But seeing no other questions, I think we're done. So thank you folks for
I just wanted to say one thing, sorry. Stay tuned to BCT. emails for some events that we will have coming up in April. Hopefully we can take this knowledge into the field as we are planning a couple of pollinator plantings. We're actually meeting with some folks from City of Durham tomorrow to scope out a location. So stay tuned for details of things coming up in April.
Thank you for lifting it up, Nadi.
Yes, no problem. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much. It was fun. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Jeanne.